Welcome to 10 Minute History, where the past happens fast. I'm your host, Taylor Smith. Joining me today is Sascha Cohen, PhD candidate at Brandeis University. Sascha, thanks so much for sitting down with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, more than happy to. So, Sascha, what are we talking about today?
So today I wanted to talk about the idea of humor in the AIDS and HIV crisis of the 1980s and the ways that gay activists used humor as an addition to something to enhance their activism and something that sort of really colored their activism in both print media and in-person protests.
Okay. Now, to best appreciate this humor, I think we're going to need a bit of context. Jokes work best when we kind of understand what's going on.
Yes.
So, what was going on in the country during this time period? Can you kind of set the stage for us?
The first thing to sort of know is that before the AIDS crisis in America, gay and lesbian individuals and organizations were performing various types of activism to combat discrimination and homophobia. And this started usually historians say this starts in 1969 with the Stonewall riots, which sort of kicks off a decade of what we call the gay liberation movement. Mm-hmm. And, starts in the cities, San Francisco, LA, New York, DC, and kind of spreads across the country. So there was about 10 years of activism prior to the AIDS crisis that various groups and organizations were building on when they needed to respond to the epidemic. So they had traditions of organizing and mobilizing their communities. And part of this tradition that is sort of understudied or not talked about a lot in the literature and even in popular culture and popular sort of political narratives is this use of satire, comedy, humor, jokes, playfulness, theater in actually fighting oppression. Then when the AIDS epidemic happened and hit these communities really hard, especially in big cities, the activists sort of could draw on this rich history of using humor in order to sort of cope, like in the sort of cathartic sense, but in a collective way. Yeah. In a collective way that was also a form of resistance and was a form of dissent.
So to make sure we understand how the humor's functioning here, that was a part of this 10 years of earlier activism before the AIDS crisis, right?
Absolutely. So okay. So something about I guess what we today call the LGBTQ or the queer community, but what was then called the gay and lesbian community, something kind of remarkable that distinguishes them from other, I guess, social movements is how much they relied on humor in their community building and in their various forms of political expression. The gay and lesbian movement always used sort of this affective mode, we would call it, as this double function of coping and surviving, but also mounting a sort of attack or an offense against the forces of bigotry.
So who then is using this humor to accomplish both this offensive and defensive kind of activism? Yeah. And how are they using it?
One of the examples that I look at a lot in my dissertation is the underground gay and lesbian press. Starting in the late 60s and all the way through the 90s, gays and lesbians had their own kind of DIY independent newspapers and magazines. Okay. Some of them were, most of them were based in big cities, but there were small towns that had them too. And they were these very like sort of homemade projects. Some of them were hand drawn and stapled. And they distributed them at community centers, at different events through the mail. And these magazines and newspapers had all of these like little cartoons and comic strips, and they had humor columns, and they had joke columns, and they had parodies, and they had sort of like similar things to like what we now think of like The Onion. Similar type. Oh, okay. Yeah, like fake news, I guess you could call it. That was very obviously a joke, right? And so they would make a lot of fun of people, of the people who were, their political enemies, and in these cartoons. And so a really good example I would say is Anita Bryant was a woman in Florida. She was a beauty queen and a singer in Florida that led the Save Our Children crusade in the late 70s. Okay. And so she wanted to essentially legalize discrimination against gays and lesbians in employment and other things. And so they would make fun. They would draw her in, caricatures of her, make fun of her. And then in real life, in person, someone threw a pie in her face when she was on national television. Okay. It was like this way of like this sort of almost like this vaudevillian slapstick gesture, right? So they would pick whoever sort of decided to make themselves an enemy of the gay community would find themselves really ridiculed and satirized in the magazines and sometimes in real life. And so it was I see it as sort of a strategy, sort of a tool in the toolkit, right? So activists and social movements have all of these tools. They can appeal to sort of pathos and to tug at your heartstrings. And a good example of that is actually the AIDS quilt, right? Which is a memorial for the people that died of AIDS. And it's this very sort of earnest, somber, sad artifact that we have. But what I'm kind of trying to point out in my dissertation is that was not the only effective mode of activism and expression. It wasn't only this very serious, AIDS is serious, it kills people, but but gays and lesbians have always had this rich history of making sort of playful fun of really sort of devastating things. Yeah. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at by looking at the different cartoons that ran in these papers, as well as the actual protests. In 1991, activists put a huge condom over Jesse Helms's, I think it was his house. Okay. So Jesse Helms was this conservative senator who enforced stigma relating to people with AIDS. He wanted to cut funding. He wanted to cut research. He said that it was the conduct of homosexuals that was responsible for the disease. So in 1991, an activist just put a huge condom over his house and said, it said, Jesse Helms is deadlier than a virus. Okay. So this is the type of the antics, the sort of type of guerrilla theater, almost similar to even an art. I see it similar as to some art installations where using symbolism and ridicule to take the power out of the person, out of the forces or the people that are harming you.
And so tying this back to a point you made earlier then, because I think I'm seeing the connections, but I want to make sure we've got this. Yeah. How does that represent resistance? Because from what I'm hearing, this is so much more than just comedy. Yes. So how does that also function as a form of resistance?
I think it does a couple of things. First, it's a way of making the people who are actually living with AIDS as visible agents on their own, who were fighting back as opposed to wasting away in their hospital beds. Because the people that were doing this were patients, were people living with and dying of AIDS. And so and so it was also friends and allies too. Sure. But it was a way of seizing control of the narrative that right-wing fundamentalist Christians were trying to create themselves. It was a way of shifting the focus and instead saying, no, actually it's the people that want to cut funding who are killing us. It's the people who don't want to promote condom use. So to try to shift focus on for the benefit of the public, to really educate the public. So it's also a form, I think it's also a form of just spreading information and education during a time when there were so many myths and misinformation about how you could get the disease, about what prevented it, about what cured it. So before scientists figured out the virus and figured out how it was spread and everything, there was just fear and there was ignorance. And so I think that these activists also saw humor as a way of combating that and of empowering patients and the community with scientific information, as opposed to these sort of the spread of these religious stigma. Yeah. They're
making people laugh, but they're also teaching them something amidst the laughter.
Exactly. So really, I think studying humor is great because it opens these portals to all of these things that it can do, because it's something that puts people's guards down. It says things without necessarily being direct. It says things in ways that are sort of coded to make them sort of go down easier.
Yeah. So I think we've done a great job of unpacking how the gay and lesbian community was able to use humor during this time period.
Yeah.
Driving things home for us now, why is this something someone needs to understand?
I think there's a few things. So I think in a way, the gay and lesbian movement in America has been remarkably successful, as has the AIDS activism in this country, because we've come so far in terms of gaining and I don't even just mean legal rights, but gaining public, social, and cultural allies and acceptance in that sense too. And AIDS as a disease, we've really transformed the way that we can deal with it so that it becomes a chronic rather than a terminal condition, with PrEP and with all of these other things. And so I think there's a lesson to be had here, that humor as a tool in the activist toolkit is actually very effective. And and it should be, and it's not the only thing. You have to work hard, and you have to build coalitions in other ways.
Sure, you have the AIDS quilt and you have pies in people's faces.
Exactly. And you have just sort of relentlessly fundraising and taking care of people who are sick, and yelling in the streets, and all of this. It's all, you need all of it. But I think that it can be very effective. And I think that as one tool in the toolkit of social movements. I think it's also important because I think it helps us understand the sort of cultural legacy of gay liberation, as well as the political. So AIDS crisis is a lot about politics, but it's also a lot about culture, and it's about how gay men particularly, lesbians too, but gay men in particular have this cultural legacy of what Susan Sontag called camp humor. This particular mode of cultural production that they've sort of gifted to our culture at large. So just as there's Jewish American humor or comedy, and there's Black and African American humor and comedy, there's also gay comedy, which is sort of its own thing that has been mainstreamed in the past 10 years or so. It's in the past decade, you have such just an absolute explosion of gay sensibility in mainstream television, film, music. That's part of their contribution. And
it sounds like, as you're talking about how this humor functioned historically, camp culture is much more than just a contribution to American comedy. It's a huge contribution to American history.
I agree.
Well, Sascha, thank you so much for unpacking the significance of something that I think has, in a lot of ways, been forgotten about the AIDS epidemic and the way in which people responded to it. Thank you so much for making us aware of this really important side of our history.
You are welcome.
Thanks again to Sascha for that interview. If you want to hear more of her work or see some of the other projects she's worked on, you can head over to her website, saschacohen.com. We'll link to that in the episode description. If you could take the time to leave us a review on iTunes or your platform of choice that allows reviews, that would be hugely helpful to us as we're getting the podcast off the ground. We have a couple reviews coming through. Thank you so much. The people who have left those, they really do help us get noticed. I can't emphasize that enough. As always, thanks very much for listening to 10 Minute History, and we will catch you in a couple weeks.